Welcome back to the class. We are beginning a discussion on Karl Marx's arguments and his theorizations about capitalism. Marx is foremost an economist. Of course, he was also a historian. He was also a political scientist, a sociologist. But the most significant contribution of Karl Marx as an intellectual lies in his analysis of capitalism as an economic system. So, while this is a course on sociology, yet we cannot really ignore his arguments about capitalism, because his analysis of capitalism is very closely connected with a host of other aspects and other themes that he wants to discuss about human society, about the conditions of working class, the way in which the capitalists group or capitalist class reap profit, the questions of exploitation, the questions of discrimination, social change, and the way in which capitalist class control other aspects of society, including ideology, political power, state power, and a host of other things. So, so far we have discussed Marxian understanding about social change, his argument about dialectical materialism, and this class and the next class as well. This will be, we will have two sessions on Marxian notion of capitalism, because it's an elaborate one. We need to spend two sessions for that. So let us begin. Now, Karl Marx as the foremost theorist and critic of capitalism. Maybe there could be hardly any other economist who spent his or her intellectual energy to understand this, the way in which a particular economic system functions, or capitalism functions, as the case of Karl Marx. And his most substantial body of work, The Capital, in 3 volumes, are devoted to understand in a meticulously economic analysis of capitalism. So he wanted to understand its function, its uniqueness, the nature of the reason for its resilience, its weaknesses, it's the way in which it exploits people, because Marx very strongly believed that it is a far more complicated system than the previous forms of economic organization or economic or modes of production like feudalism or slavery. And then Marx also was one of the most stringent critics of capitalism. So while he was a critic, he wanted to understand how it works. So the following are some of the very important economic analysis of Marx, which he brings in quite a lot of new terms and terminologies, new ideas, new perspectives in light. So Marx uses the notion of use value and exchange value as a primary building blocks for his theory on capitalism. So Marx used the notion of use value as a value emanating from its use and consumption of any material. For example, if somebody produces a pair of chappals, these chappals are used by people, and this particular use, that it has a value emerging from the fact that it can be used, it can be consumed. A shirt or a pen or food or any economic product has a use value when it is being consumed. On the other hand, exchange value is when it is produced as commodities. Goods are destined for sale or exchange rather than personal consumption, and acquires this dual character. You know that when economy develops from a hunting-gathering system to that of a more settled agricultural life, this entire network of exchange also developed. People produce various things and they exchange in the market, either formal or informal market, for other forms of goods. So Marx argues that at this particular time, most of the goods acquired these two characters. One is that this material can be consumed, thereby talking about the use value, and secondly, they can be exchanged for certain other goods. Rather, along with either they can be consumed or they can be exchanged for other goods. So in the pre-capitalist circuit of commodity exchange, one commodity, that is C, is sold for money, which is in turn used for purchase of another commodity. Marx refers to this cycle of exchange it is CMC as the simple circulation of commodities. So he's making a theory trying to understand what is something so unique about the capitalist system. So in a pre-capitalist circuit of commodity exchange, one commodity is sold for money, you sell one commodity in the market and you get money, and with that money you buy something else. So it is a CMC, commodity, money and commodity. With capitalist commodity production, this simple circuit of exchange is inverted. Money is used to purchase commodities which after some refashioning are subsequently sold for even more money. So here you are talking about a capitalist system where raw materials are brought in and labor is involved and it is refashioned into certain other thing and then sold for even more money. So you use money to buy commodity, you refashion it, you invest your labor and other thing and you sell it for more money. So here that the previous equation of CMC is inverted into MCM, commodity, money and commodity. Money, commodity and money. With the simple circulation of commodities in pre-capitalist circulation, money is spent to satisfy needs. Selling in order to buy. Okay. So it was you sell certain thing in order to buy certain other things immediately to satisfy your needs. With this capitalist circulation of commodities, money is invested to accumulate more money. It is the ultimate objective is not to consume but to make more money, but to buy new items. Money is invested to accumulate more money, buying in order to sell. The goals of these two circuits of exchange differ. In the pre-capitalist mode of production, it was consumption and in the first case and profit in the second case. So in the second one, you buy certain thing and you refashion it, you sell it, and the ultimate aim is to make more money, and that money is nothing but profit as per Marxian argument. The continuous exchange of commodities in the capitalist mode is not the production of use value, Marx insists, nor profit on any single transaction, but rather the unceasing movement of profit making. So if in the pre-capitalist society this transaction was very simple and it ended with consumption, in a capitalist situation Marx argues that making a profit becomes a never-ending process. Making a profit becomes a never-ending process, and because this transaction does not close in the first transaction itself. In the continuous exchange of commodities in the capitalist mode is not the production of use value, Marx insists, nor profit in any single transaction, but rather the unceasing, the endless movement of profit making. What spurs the capitalist into action, Marx says, is not the enjoyment of use value. This is an extremely important point when he develops his argument about fetishism of commodities. You are making things not for the consumption, but not for the enjoyment of use value, but for the augmentation of exchange values. Not the fulfillment of human needs, but for the accumulation of wealth. And that, Marx argues, has made capitalism an extremely desirable, extremely profitable, extremely alluring form of economic activity. That you have reached a state where all your basic needs can be met, but human beings have devised, they have identified a new system where wealth can be, unending forms of wealth can be, endless form of wealth can be created through this continuous exchange of goods. Now, a major argument that, or a major component, an extremely original argument that Marx brings into this entire discussion is his labor theory of value, is bringing human labor as a central concern, as a central theme in this entire analysis of economic activity. And we will discuss his preoccupation with labor in coming class as well when we discuss his arguments about alienation. And this is a central concern for Marx, the ability of human beings to work, the ability of human beings to produce certain things, as Marx has argued, it is a unique ability of human beings, that is something so special to human species that separates human beings from other animals or other species, and that is something unique on various counts. So that is why Marx is extremely disturbed when this particular unique ability of human being is being distorted under this system of capitalism. And Marx, in his in his arguments, he believes in his romantic ideas about a classless society. Marx believes that human beings will be able to fully enjoy his labor. He will find happiness in his labor, whereas in this exploitative system, he does not, a worker or a laborer does not find any enjoyment while doing his work. So this labor has a very important position in both Marxian philosophical arguments as well as his economic analysis. One of the fundamental features of commodities of exchange that make them comparable is that they are produced of abstract human labor. Okay? When you produce certain thing, when you bring in a couple of raw materials and then make a new products out of that, this new product is not a mere assemblage of all the raw materials, but rather there is a labor involved. It is the labor that is actually giving shape to this new commodity, and they are the products of abstract human labor. And he is deliberately using this abstract human labor in order to make it as a blanket term to describe different forms of labor, both skilled and unskilled and others. That means labor in general measured in units of time, ignoring the specific operations that differentiate one kind of work from the other. So he is talking about the kind of time invested by worker in order to produce a particular product. This line of thinking leads Marx to adopt a labor theory of value. The relative value of commodities, he states, are determined by the respective quantities or amounts of labor worked up, realized, fixed in them. So he argues that one of the most important ways of making sense of a value of a particular object is to understand the amount of human labor that is invested in its worked up, realized, fixed in them. Because without human labor, a product cannot be produced. The value of a product is not only the value of its raw material, but the amount of human labor that is being invested in that. In sum, Marx's labor theory of value is this: commodities exchange according to their average labor time needed to produce them under normal conditions of production. So once commodities get exchanged, that happens on the basis of the average labor time needed to produce them under the normal conditions of production. Marx uses the concept of primitive accumulation to explain the emergence of two classes. One, those who own money and commodities, and the other who own nothing but the labor power. And this is an extremely important argument about the primitive accumulation, how wealth is being created, how this particular class emerges as a class that owns most of the means of production in different stages in history. So he gives a detailed analysis of emergence of capitalism in England. So taking the case of England, he provides a historical account of how a mercantile class and traders transformed into capitalist bourgeoisie by accumulating private property. So it's a detailed elaboration how he talks about how a small class of mercantile class and then traders transformed into capitalist bourgeoisie. And he talks about how this small agricultural land was taken over by larger this group, and then this whole agriculture itself transformed into a kind of a capitalist enterprise. At the same time, a modern working class also appears on the scene as feudal agriculture workers, peasants or serfs are transformed into dependent wage laborers. So this is a great transformation that we discussed or in the previous sessions as well, when feudalism breaks down and capitalism emerges, when the fundamental form of economic activity is transformed from that of an agriculture to that of industry, when a rural society transforms itself into an urban society, when industrial production replaces agricultural production, along with the emergence of a bourgeoisie class who owns these new factories and technologies and tools and other things, there is also an emergence of a new class of laborers, okay, who earlier were the feudal agricultural workers who were affiliated to specific masters. Now they become more free dependent laborers, or peasants or serfs are transformed into dependent wage laborers. And these qualities, the characteristic features of these wage laborers are something very important which we will discuss now. Agricultural workers are first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, torched by grotesque terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage laborer. And this is an extremely important argument, because the idea of primitive accumulation is still used by a host of scholars to understand what is happening even in the contemporary times. When mega developmental projects are brought in, when ordinary peasants or when agricultural land is taken over, when people are displaced forcibly, we know that this whole argument about development through displacement or forced eviction, enforced eviction, where large thousands of people are displaced in the name of development. There are quite a lot of scholars who make use of this particular argument about primitive accumulation to make sense of that. So this is exactly the kind of a process that takes place. They are first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their home, turned into vagabond, and then whipped, branded, tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws. And here, we know that the bourgeoisie cannot enact laws by themselves. They only have wealth. But Marx argues that the state, the political elite, are the one who will work for the interest of the bourgeoisie. So the state will enact laws which would invariably support the economic interest of the bourgeoisie. They will never support the law, they will never make a law, they will never formulate a law that would support the interest of the working class, because the state is always, state by definition, by its own character, supports the interest of the bourgeoisie, and the workers are only left to fend for themselves. Workers are able to find any solution only through their own organized activity and then collective bargaining into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. And this is again a very important term. What is the kind of a discipline required for a wage laborer? And there are very fascinating arguments about it, because you know that the everyday life organization in a feudal society was completely different from that of a capitalist era. The setting of factory and the sound of siren are extremely important in organizing human activity in a capitalist era. With the sound of a siren, you start your work. Then with another sound, you pause for your break, your tea break, or for your lunch break. Again, you resume at the sound of a siren. So the siren defines, or it decides, the rhythm of human activity. And once the siren begins, you're supposed to enter into the production under strict surveillance. Remember the factory scene in Charlie Chaplin's The Modern Times. So that requires discipline. That requires some amount of education. That requires some amount of obedience at a mass level. And the role of the state is something very important in making that kind of a disciplined, docile working class. Hence, the birth of a new class of free workers. Okay? Free in a double sense. First, unlike either slaves or serfs, they are not the property of their masters, and hence free to dispose their capacity for labor however they wish. So this is an extremely important point again. We remember, if you remember the previous session, previous classes, when Marx talks about the revolution, he argued that the changes in the forces of production will force changes in the relations of production. Okay? So when technological changes take the modes of production into a particular level, then it will realize that the existing relations of production is no longer conducive for the further development, and then that will it will be seen as a fetter, it will be seen as a chain, as an obstacle, as an impediment, and then that conflict leads to a revolution where it reaches it is propelled to a qualitatively different realm, where the forces of production are much advanced and relations of production are also completely redefined. Or Marx would argue that you could not have had a feudal type of relationship between the workers and the bourgeoisie in the era of capitalism. In the era of capitalism, you can't have the workers being owned by the bourgeoisie. There is no need for it, or it will only hinder the further development, and he explains why it hinders. So there is emergence of a new free class of workers who are free in comparison with the slaves and the serfs who were seen as the property of their masters and free to dispose their capacity of labor. However, so this particular new class of free workers, they are free to dispose of their capacity to labor however they wish. They can sell their labor to the highest bidder. They are free agents. They can work in a particular factory. Next day they can resign and they can go to the next one. They can offer to sell their labor to anybody who gives them the highest amount of money. Second meaning of the term, second, owning neither land nor tools. They are free of all possessions in any means of production. So that is another interesting way in which why Marx calls them as free workers, because they are free of anything. They are free of all possessions. They don't own land, they don't own any tools, and they are free. These free workers, as Marx ironically puts it, are compelled to sell themselves voluntarily. Again, you see the play of words. These free workers are compelled to sell themselves voluntarily. Okay, they are compelled to sell themselves voluntarily because they have only their labor to sell to meet their daily needs. They are free insofar as they do not belong to this or that capitalist. Okay, they are not affiliated to one permanently. They are not owned by this capitalist X or Y, Marx says, but since they must hire themselves out to someone or starve, they do belong to one or another capitalist. Very, very interesting formulation. Okay, so they have two options. One option is to be free, but being free does not fetch you food. So the other option of selling out yourself is to starve and die of starvation, because you don't have anything to eat, because you don't own any means of production. You don't have any land, you don't have any tools, and you have only one option, that is to sell yourself, sell your labor. So since they must hire themselves out to someone or starve, they do belong to one or another capitalist. So either once they do not belong to this particular or that particular capitalist X or Y, but they have to belong to either this or that. Now he further elaborates the uniqueness of labor power. For 5 points. First, the determination of the value of labor power differs from that of other commodities because it depends on society's level of development and cultural standards. So we know that the quality of labor power is quite different in comparison with in accordance with the different epochs in history. So the value of labor power, it is dependent on the society's level of development and the cultural standards, how much you value the labor power. Second, though it is bought and sold in the market, capitalists do not produce labor power and therefore do not control its supply in the same manner as they do for other commodities. This is a very unique way in which the relationship between the capitalist and the workers are defined. Okay? Capitalists cannot produce labor power the way they produce, maybe say for example, a raw material. They can control the supply of that, but here it is beyond that. It becomes an independent variable. Third, capitalists consume labor power by extracting as much as labor effort as possible from often resistant workers, and this process rife with conflict is unlike that entailed by the consumption of other goods. Again, the relationship between the capitalist and the workers is quite different, because here capitalist is dealing with the workers, and here the old saying time is money. And again, remember how Charlie Chaplin depicts that worker who is constantly forced to ramp up his activity. The pace of his work is so frantic that he hardly gets time for everything. So in a factory, the workers are under relentless surveillance to maintain a specific speed, which is often decided by somebody else. So he becomes a part, he becomes a cog in the larger scheme of things. So unlike any other commodity, the capitalists always have a very problematic relationship with that of the workers, resistant workers, and this process rife with conflict is unlike that entailed by the consumption of other goods. Fourth, labor power is a particularly special commodity and uniquely available, uniquely valuable from the standpoint of the capitalist class, because it is capable of producing surplus value. This is the key of Marxian analysis of capitalism. Marxian analysis of capitalism, as we will see in the coming slides, is completely revolves around the idea of surplus value. And according to Marxian economics, this surplus value emerges not from the raw material, not from the technology, but from the labor. Finally, labor power is a peculiar commodity also because it is an inherent ability. It is an inherent ability of human beings. Now, this labor power is again uncomparable with any other raw material or any other technology, because it is an inherent quality of human beings, okay, which involves their creativity, which involves their sense of aesthetics, which involves their boundless forms of imagination. So you cannot really compare the labor power with that of any other commodity, okay. Though while we look at very gloomy picture about human labor, when we look at it only at its ugly or physical or crude physical form, Marx had a much larger vision or understanding about the potentials of human labor, which includes a human being's ability to imagine, to be creative, to work with ethics, to work with in a politically conscious manner. So since this ability, human beings are somebody who quite unique, Marx understood the ability of labor as something very, very significant, extremely important, which is uncomparable with any other forms of say raw material or technology or other aspects. So the value of labor power, as with any other commodity, is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor required for its production. That is, the maintenance of the worker in a healthy so far as to ensure a steady supply of replacement workers. So here this is again a very important point. So Marx argues that the value of a labor power has to be something, it is not only that seen as a compensation of the time that the worker spends in the factory. Rather, you need to keep that worker in good condition. You need to ensure that the worker is able to function as a normal, as a functioning member of the society. You need to have a socially necessary labor required for its production, that is for the maintenance of the worker in a healthy, socially productive, in a more humane manner, in a more civilized manner, and to ensure a steady supply of replacement workers. So you also require a steady flow of replacement workers. So the remuneration of workers should not be limited, should not be seen simply as the exact remuneration of the work that he is submitting at the time of work, or he is producing at the time of work. Rather, the remuneration of the value of the labor power is much more higher, because a person is able to work only if his social life or his family life or his other existence as a healthy human being is taken care, and he is also supposed to give birth to new children and to raise new section of new to find out replacement of workers. The value to maintain this vary as per the historic specifications, which we know that when society moves from one stage to the another, when society improves, the needs also improve, the needs also expand, and the quality of people change, the aspirations of people change, the requirements of people change. So the value of maintain this labor power also vary as per the historical specifications. Since the law of supply and demand does not apply to laborers in the usual manner, what mechanism ensures that the price of labor power remains roughly equal to its value? Why are workers typically unable to obtain more than a social subsistence wage? The answer to this question is found in what Marx refers to as the industrial reserve army, or the surplus group of unemployed. So on the one hand, Marx argues very vehemently that the labor power cannot be compared with the other forms of raw material. It is innately qualitatively different. It is something very important, and a worker needs to be compensated not only for meeting his immediate needs like hunger, to quench the hunger, but it has a much larger value. But in reality, Marx argues, especially given the situation, given the condition of factories and industrial scenario during his time, workers are paid the minimum. Workers are paid the bare minimum to meet their subsistence. They don't starve, especially if you look into the history of labor struggle. If you look into the history of labor struggles and working conditions in across Europe or across the world, what we see is nothing but the stories of exploitation, whether it is in coal mines or in agricultural fields or in any other field. The workers were barely kept as healthy people. They were given food, they were given bare minimum clothing so that they are able to work. Okay, so the kind of a romantic idea that Marx has, the kind of a very very interesting idea that Marx has about workers are never honored, or they were never appreciated, or they were never realized in the actual setting. So Marx is asking the question why that the workers are not being compensated the way they should have been, and the answer why that the workers typically unable to obtain more than a social subsistence wage. And the answer Marx provides is because there is an industrial reserve army of workers, or there is a surplus group of unemployed people at all the time. There is an excessive supply of people, while the industrialists are not able to control the supply and demand as they can do with other raw materials. For example, if they can reduce or increase the production of oil, they can reduce or increase the excavation of certain other kind of minerals. But in the case of labor power already exists in a given situation, and the bourgeoisie has hardly any control over the availability of that. So in most of the time, the industrial reserve army already exists. There is a surplus group of unemployed people who are always already waiting there to be employed, and that plays a very important role in keeping their wages much lower than what they actually deserve. So a substantial supply of unemployed workers, potentially in competition for jobs of the employed, keep wages from rising above their values. So the same point that we discussed. So there is always a reserve army of unemployed people waiting to be employed, and who are ready to sell their labor at much lower rate than what they actually deserve. So the bourgeoisie is able to keep it always lower. The existence of a large pool of jobless workers desperate for employment, and as per Marxian argument, their other only option is that of starvation, inhibit workers with jobs desperate to remain employed from demanding higher wages. So the moment you ask for higher wages, they could be terminated, and another group of people who are desperate to get employed can be employed at a much lower wage. If rising wages due to scarcity of labor or economic growth put a squeeze on profit, and then Marx brings in the element of dynamics, because many times the industry sees this upward and downward mobility, upward and downward movement. So if there is a scarcity of labor, or there is a phase of sudden economic expansion, then you might find a scarcity of laborers, and then the labor the rate of the labor might go up. In that situation, capitalists will respond by cutting back investment or substituting machinery for labor, because this is something which would very badly affect the prospect of profit for the bourgeoisie. So they would cut down either investment, cutting back investment, or substituting machinery for labor. In either case, replenishing the surplus population, resulting in a renewed downward pressure on wages and restoring conditions for a profitable growth. So Marx has an elaborate discussion, or on the basis of experiences, on the basis of specific experiences in Europe and in other Western European countries, about how the cycles of upward growth and then downgrowth on the basis of experience of England and other Western societies. Marx has very elaborate explanations about this upward and downward growth of industries were monitored, they were mastered, and the wages were always kept at a low, and the profit was ensured. So the great beauty of capitalist production, Marx says, is that it constantly reproduces the wage laborer as a wage laborer, but also always produces a relative surplus population of wage laborers in proportion to the accumulation of capital. So this, he argues, is the crux of capitalist mode of production, is that it constantly reproduces the wage laborer as wage laborer. The wage laborer never gets the possibility to change their class into something else, but also always produces a relative surplus population of wage laborers in proportion to the accumulated capital. So this constant supply of unemployed wage laborers outside there, who can be employed at will at the expense of the existing people who might be demanding more wage, is the key, according to Marx, which makes this capitalist enterprise extremely profitable. So the two classes of workers, one unable to work enough and the other forced to work too much, and this circumstance keeps the wages low enough to maintain profitability for the capitalist. So this is the central key argument of Marx, because it shows the dilemma of being a worker. Once you enter into a factory, then you completely lose your independence, your ability, your creativity, your own pace of things, your opinion. You become a kind of a dehumanized entity. You work like a machine as long as you are there. And if you do not take this option, then you join a large group of people who are desperately waiting to be employed. So Marx argues that the worker of a capitalist era either have to contend with these two unenviable situations. Either you remain as unemployed, staring at starvation, looking or leading a very miserable life, or the moment you get into a factory, then you are under another oppressive, extremely oppressive system of exploitation. And so keeps wages low enough to maintain profitability for the capitalist. So this is how Marx argues that the capitalists are able to maintain the maximum amount of profitability. They are able to maintain profitability all through, mostly or only through exploiting the workers. And this, of course, we know that it's a very pessimistic view about industrialism, and that was especially influenced by the kind of industrial atmosphere during Marxian time. And we will continue this theme in the next class, because it requires more lengthy discussion. So I am winding up here, and we will continue the same theme on Marxian discussion on capitalism in the next class. So thank you.